we can go until that long if we need. And so to open things up, I'll begin. I have met many of you, but not everyone. So my name is Deirdre Lally, and I'm the Western Maryland Conservation Organizer for the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club. And I work on Beyond Gas in the state of Maryland and help guide our wonderful volunteer-led Beyond Gas Steering Committee, whose idea it was to have this conference tonight. And we will also be hearing from Kelly Canavan from Amps Creek Council. So thank you everyone for getting on, and I'm going to start us off with a couple of minutes to talk about the Potomac Pipeline fight. And that'll start us off on a section that we're going to do on the current fracked gas infrastructure fights in Maryland. So Ruth Alice, if you wouldn't mind queuing up the Potomac Pipeline slides.
Oops. How did I do this again?
So I think you go to present. Yeah, there we go.
But how do I do it through the
Oh, from current slide.
Right. Okay.
All right. There we go. Okay, so the Potomac Pipeline has been one of the priorities of the Sierra Club Beyond Gas work since the beginning of this year, and really before that. Next slide, please. So here you can see a map of where the Potomac Pipeline is actually proposed to go. And you can tell it doesn't go through a lot of Maryland, it mostly goes through West Virginia. But in 2016, a West Virginia gas company called Mountaineer Gas proposed this fracked gas pipeline that puts the Potomac River at risk. The Eastern Panhandle Expansion Project is another name for this pipeline project. TransCanada is the company that's in charge of this pipeline. Most of the route is proposed to cross through karst geology, which we'll get into in a couple of minutes. The pipeline would bring fracked gas from Pennsylvania through Maryland to the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia for private industry for a demand that they don't actually have yet. So there's no benefit to be found to anybody who's impacted by this pipeline. Next slide, please. So TransCanada, so we say two projects, one pipeline, because as many pipeline projects go, this one is segmented between West Virginia and Maryland. In the Maryland side of things, we've got TransCanada. It's 3.37 miles, 8-inch distribution line that would go through Maryland. The pipeline received FERC approval on July 19th of 2018. So FERC approval is called the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, and this allows the company to start taking landowners to eminent domain court. It's kind of the last big federal approval that the industry needs to move forward. And so the No Potomac Pipeline Coalition that has been working very, very hard over the past year and a half is now looking at a potential strategy to target the FERC certificate. Next slide, please. Oh, I think you went a little too far. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so Mountaineer Gas is the company operating this pipeline project in West Virginia. The West Virginia portion of the pipeline is already under construction. There's 53 miles of the pipeline that run through West Virginia. It's a 10-inch gas line. There has been no proof of potential business interests in this pipeline, but the West Virginia Public Service Commission granted approval. West Virginia waived the 401 certification, which means that any strict regulations about how the pipeline is constructed through wetlands and waterways was waived by the state. And so now residents in West Virginia have already been facing construction since the spring. Next slide, please. So Eastern Panhandle Protectors is the group on the ground doing a lot of community organizing in West Virginia. And I'll give you all a couple minutes, or well, a few seconds to look at this slide. We're trying to keep everything to 5 minutes. But Mountaineer Gas began constructing in December of 2018. So in the interest of time, we'll keep moving through the slides. Next slide, please. The environmental threats are the pollution impacts, 19 streams and 10 wetlands. In Maryland, 100 streams in West Virginia, stormwater runoff, impacts to endangered species habitat, horizontal directional drilling causes a lot of blowouts through similar pipelines in karst geology regions. Next slide.
Did I not go?
Oh, next slide.
Hmm?
Next slide. Yep, there we go. Something that's important to mention, the pipeline incidents have been going down since 1940. However, in the recent years, starting in 2000, they actually started going up quite rapidly. So please note the pipelines built this decade are failing at an even faster pace than pipelines that are more than 70 years old. Next slide, please. So these are photos of what's happening with construction in West Virginia. This is land clearing. Next slide, please. The human health impacts are, we've got blowout events during the construction phase. The pipeline is set to be built through the Potomac River, which could directly impact 100,000 people's drinking water. Karst geology, which is essentially a geological Swiss cheese under the ground, faces an extreme risk of blowouts from this kind of pipeline construction. And so impacts to water could be quite unprecedented. Next slide, please. And here's a graph of karst geology to explain a little bit more about what I mean. Next slide, please. There could be irreversible damage to the C&O Canal. Farm acreage is already being taken out of production, which means a loss of income for farmers. There's routine gas company intrusion, there's loss of property value, and at any time gas companies can add additional pieces of infrastructure. And so residents now have to be quite careful about what they sign. Next slide, please. And here are a number of the groups that have been involved in the No Potomac Pipeline Coalition. We've got Chesapeake Climate Action Network, Food and Water Watch, Sierra Club, Eastern Panhandle Protectors, and the Upper Potomac Riverkeeper. Next slide, please. And ways you can help. So we've got a number of things going on. The Eastern Panhandle Protectors in West Virginia are asking for people to help them with canvassing along the impacted route, to attend Eastern Panhandle Protector-led meetings. And we are also asking people at this point to contact the Maryland Board of Public Works. Next slide, please. So I'll leave this up for a second. Right now, the Maryland Board of Public Works does have say over issuing a wetlands license for the pipeline to be built through a portion of the Potomac River. And so here is a sample talking point, and you can call Peter Francho and Nancy Kopp and ask them to deny the wetlands license. I realize I went through this really quickly because we've got a lot to cover tonight. This presentation is being recorded, and so we're happy to send this to you. And please keep a note, write down any questions you have, as we will have a large question and answer portion at the end. And so at this point, I'm going to hand things over to the Eastern Shore Pipeline. So Ruth Alice White is going to update us on the Eastern Shore Pipeline.
Yes, hi. This is a slide from a newspaper article about the pipeline. It's approximate. There's been, and the article described it as proposed Delmarva pipeline. There's an organizer who's been working to focus on this pipeline. She's been trying to get people on the Eastern Shore to step up and be leaders in their counties, but that hasn't worked out. So the last she said is she's focusing on the company who is proposing the pipeline, which is located in Baltimore. mentioned in the article, and she's named this the Eastern Shore Pipeline, has a web page and a Facebook page about it. So we're just trying to keep track. She had a training on doing direct action on Sunday in, I think, Harford County. And we will see what comes of this. We also are working with a coalition that we'll talk about later that's looking at opposing all frack gas and other fossil fuel infrastructure in Maryland, and legislation is one of the things that that group is looking at. We'll talk about that later.
And Ruth Alice, the slides that you're sharing are getting cut off, so I don't know if there's some way you can adjust that on your screen.
So this one shows up okay on my screen. We'll send the link to the slides to everyone. PowerPoint link of the slides.
All right. So moving on from the Eastern Shore Pipeline, we've got Kelly Canavan, who works at the Imps Creek Council, to give us an update on Cove Point LNG export facility and the Charles County compressor station.
Okay. So
excuse me, is anyone here from Southern Maryland Group? Have we heard from them today? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kelly.
Rose is on.
I'm here. I'll let Kelly go first, and I'll jump in after.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the Cove Point Export Terminal is functioning, unfortunately. The folks who live in Cove Point have been leading weekly protests outside the governor's mansion. They led them for a year and have just recently seized those and are looking for a new direction at this point. They were asking for what's called a quantitative risk assessment, but it's a safety study for the facility, which they believe would show clearly that it is an unsafe facility and should be shut down. So what's happening now is folks are looking at other ways to impact that facility rather than stopping construction, since it's now functioning and now in service, and are looking forward also with the possibility that Dominion will try to put in a second liquefaction train, which is something that Dominion CEO Tom Farrell has said that he would like to do if they can get the land to do that. So, so folks in Cove Point are looking towards possibly opposing expansion of that plant. And this is just a photo of one of the rallies outside the governor's mansion. So one of the ways that folks are looking towards impacting that plant is through stopping a compressor station on the Cove Point Pipeline. There's only one pipeline that feeds the Dominion Export Terminal, and that is the Dominion Cove Point Pipeline. And Dominion has proposed what they're calling the Eastern Market Access Project, which would include expansions of pipelines in Loudoun County and Pleasant Valley, and then a new compressor station in Charles County, Maryland, just on the border of Prince George's County. And so this is a photo after a heavy rain of where the compressor station would be built on existing Dominion property. And there's a lovely swamp on the right, Mill Swamp. Next slide, please. So we have been, we being a coalition of groups, Amp Creek, Spear, Cove Point, Sierra Club has been very involved, and other groups have been fighting this project since 2016 when it was announced. This is a photo of a community event where we had a dinner and and showed people how to send comments to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission opposing the project. It does have FERC approval. What is standing in the way is that it was denied local approval. So it was denied the zoning permits that it needs by the Charles County Board of Appeals, and has not received the permits it needs from the Maryland Department of the Environment. And those are an air quality permit, a dewatering permit, and a discharge permit. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we have been represented by several, by a legal team at each phase of this process. This is us before the Charles County Board of Appeals, testifying, and as I said, they decided twice to deny that permit. Dominion then sued the Charles County Board of Appeals and the Charles County Commissioners, and the Amp Creek Council filed a motion to intervene in that lawsuit, which is a federal lawsuit, and we are still waiting for the judge to make a decision on that motion. It may not be until September 24th that that decision gets made. Next slide, please. So this has been a large community effort, which has included things such as direct action, which you see there at the site of the proposed compressor station. Next slide, please. Thank you. And also at various hearings, we've enjoyed really strong community turnout and support, and that's been much appreciated. And so what we're looking forward, what we're seeing in the future now is the need to get comments in opposing the dewatering permit and the discharge permit, because the permits that could permanently stop this project from moving forward are permits that fall under the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Air and Clean Water Act, and those would include the 3 permits that the Maryland Department of the Environment is considering. The deadline for the dewatering permit comments is August 10th, and a deadline has not yet been set for the discharge permits, but it will be soon after. We have already delayed the project a great deal. The project was originally set to begin construction in November of 2017. However, we are encouraging people to focus on denial rather than delay as a tactic. Delay as a tactic at this point could actually backfire on us. And so rather than asking for things like safety assessments and that sort of thing, we're asking for people to just present the evidence that they have and ask for a denial, rather than for something to happen before a denial or to qualify that denial.
Oops.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Kelly. This is Rosa Hance. I'm gonna jump in because Jill asked me to, as a group chair of the Southern Maryland group of the Sierra Club. I wanted to, well, thank you, Kelly, for giving that update. And I wanted to dispel some rumors that I think are circulating now about Sierra Club's relationship with Dominion and Sierra Club's stance on this project. We are fully committed to stopping all of these projects and pipelines fully and in full support of the denial process of each and every one of these permits. The Sierra Club has had for a little bit of backstory, in Southern Maryland, as Kelly has said, we have the Dominion Cove Point export terminal in our backyard, so this is very personal to us. And the Sierra Club has a settlement with Dominion that dates back to in the 1970s, when the gas company at the time was Columbia Gas was starting that wanted to build in what was going to be a state park. And in the process of fighting against that, that project, Sierra Club lost, but was granted basically a settlement in which the Sierra Club has trustees on a board with the Maryland Conservation Council and Dominion that make up the Cove Point Natural Heritage Trust. When that settlement was created, it not only created the trust, but also limited the footprint that Dominion Cove Point is allowed to expand into. The trust has, it has an executive director who happens to be a Sierra Club executive committee member, and the trust is focused on land preservation and also, you know, maintaining our natural beauty in the face of natural gas infrastructure that is in our territory. So what happened very recently that I want to clarify, I see someone ask, that was for an import facility. It was originally, it has since expanded into an export facility. A lot of this happened before any of us on the call were involved, but if you want to ask questions or get, in fact, I have a whole document of the history of how the Sierra Club and Dominion have been at odds for the past several decades. I'd be happy to share it with you. Recently at a Cove Point Natural Heritage Trust meeting, which, as I said, Sierra Club has a seat on that committee, Dominion made a verbal offer to have land purchased for the trust in exchange for a modification of the terms of the settlement. Basically, they offered to buy us 400 acres of land, and by us, I don't mean the Sierra Club, I mean the Cove Point Natural Heritage Trust, 400 acres of land for the trust if the Sierra Club trustees would allow the sign off on an expansion of Dominion's footprint by 75 acres to the north of the plant. This is a verbal offer. We have not gotten any written offer on it. We haven't made any public statement up until this point because there was no written offer. We didn't really know what exactly was going on. We've been waiting for them to explain what it is that they want to do beyond this 75 acre point. We don't have any commitments or any explanation from them. But as Kelly said, rightly so, it stands to reason that a liquefaction train would be on their radar because they've said publicly that that's what they want to do. I'm here to clarify that Sierra Club has no intention of being bought by Dominion. We have no intention of having our trustees sign off on any expansion that Dominion were to want. We are in a fact-gathering mission at this point. We are not for sale. So if there are any questions or if there is anyone who wants to get involved or has any information or basically wants to work with the Southern Maryland group and a number of people on this call on that particular issue, please contact me separately and my info will go out after the call. And I'll also be on for Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly and Rosa, very much. So now that we've heard about some of the major fracked gas fights across the state, we're going to move into new tools for fighting back. And so for this next piece, I'm going to hand it over to Annie Bristow, and she's going to talk about the Sierra Club fact sheet on fracked gas and the Food and Water Watch fact sheet as well. So take it away, Annie. Annie, you are muted. Are you able to unmute yourself, or does Zach need to do that?
How's that?
Ah, we got you.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The oil and gas industry has worked hard to separate fracking from the other tentacles of their industry. And while some in industry are still insisting that frack gas is a bridge to clean, renewable future for all of us, There are actually some who are being rather honest about what they're up to. And at a June meeting of the World Gas Conference in DC, the Chief Executive Officer of British Petroleum, and this is a quote, "We need to help people recognize gas as a destination fuel, not as a transition fuel." And in a recent meeting, the Maryland Department of Environment, who sponsors the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, an industry presentation where they talked about possibilities of development throughout the world for natural gas. A member of that commission asked how long do they envision that bridge to be? And the answer from industry is we have about 150 years of supply of natural gas that we will be quite happy to exploit. That's not a direct quote. So the industry has plans to continue building. So I feel like in some ways the folks who fought fracking were a little late to the scene in recognizing the extent to which natural gas infrastructure build-out was happening while we were engaged in those battles. These two new fact sheets, one by Sierra Club, which is the first one up, are really looking at debunking a lot of the myths and the misinformation that we've been fed over time about the necessity of these projects. This is not a, this is not a clean renewable fuel for our future, or it never was considered renewable, but this is a fossil fuel, is not clean and will continue to lock us into climate change. If you could go to the next slide, please. The myths that are talked about, oh, I don't see the Food and Water Watch one. There's a Food and Water Watch fact sheet too that is linked to and what was sent to you. That fact sheet takes a lot of the information covered in the Sierra Club fact sheet and brings it home to Maryland. So I'm going to talk about some of those, the information in both fact sheets in a minute. I wanted to start with a recent quote from Bill McGibbon, who said that the climate movement's biggest failure has been to successfully make the case that natural gas is not a clean replacement for other fossil fuels. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think we, particularly in Maryland, out of necessity, focused on the fracking fight, but at the same time we were doing that fight, and it's at the close to the same time that Governor Hogan was not opposing the ban and went ahead and signed it. He was signing agreements with AltaGas and Washington Gas and Light to build out infrastructure throughout Maryland. He was doing backroom deals with TransCanada on the Potomac Pipeline. Next slide, please. Actually, two more slides. Oops. One more, please. So this is what's been, no, go back. This is what's been going on while the gas industry has been fracking all over our nation and particularly in our region. Global methane has been going up. We are having a sharp increase in a very strong climate forcing gas. And this is now considered to be anywhere from 87 to 98% more powerful as a climate forcer than carbon dioxide. It's not the only problem with methane. And again, industry has worked hard to keep fracking out of the picture of thinking of natural gas infrastructure, but with all of the methane that we're producing comes a lot of toxic chemicals and problems, particularly with our neighbors in Pennsylvania and West Virginia from the toxic effects from fracking. Next slide, please. One of the problems with this industry is controlling leaks. And this slide shows you all the places in the life cycle of natural gas from production, extraction, production, all the way to end use, including the gas stove in your home, if you have one, of all the points of leakage. It is estimated that about 3% of gas that is produced is leaked to the atmosphere. This is a short-term radiative forcing gas. It acts in the 20 to 10 to 20 year time frame. Unfortunately, that's the time frame we're most concerned with in terms of climate change. Next slide, please. So this is, I mentioned this earlier, how much more powerful global warming potential methane has than carbon dioxide. Meanwhile, what's happening in a lot of the fights, and has traditionally happened, is everyone's been focused on coal and that we need to get off of coal. Coal is also very polluting to the environment from extraction to end use. And, you know, it's, industry seized on this and said that this was a natural, a clean bridge to a healthier future. And you'll see that it is not at all going to take us to where we need to be on climate change. It's also a very unhealthy solution. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that the Food and Water Watch fact sheet brings this home to Maryland. So what that fact sheet does is go through many of the infrastructure in Maryland. Touch on a few so that you have a sense of the variety of what's going on. You've already heard about the compressor station and the pipelines under development or proposed. We also have compressor stations in Myersville and Howard County that are either under expansion or they're talking about expansion. We have one underground natural gas storage facility in the state. It's 52 years old. One of the things I want you to start getting a sense of, some of these pipelines are 70 years old. Compressor stations can live for 50 to 70 years. These things are not short-term solutions. When we invest in them, we're investing in them for 30 to 50 to 70 years, and we're locking up our resources into those. And that is exactly what Governor Hogan is trying to do in our state. And meanwhile, he says that he's signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement. Several state governors have done so. It's our opinion that he cannot meet those goals if he continues to build out infrastructure in this state. Kelly mentioned the LNG facility at Cove Point. We're concerned that a lot of the pipelines in this region are being built out to serve that. And with some of the current talk just very recently with our president looking at some of these trade deals and reduction of tariffs, may grease the skids for further LNG exports. Next slide, please. And this is what we're up against at the federal level. This was part of the decision for the Potomac Pipeline, and then they've just issued this as a statement of how they see themselves moving forward. That is not their job to regulate the product that's going through the pipeline, but to look instead at just the pipelines. That's a huge problem for us because that means that nobody's regulating the product in the pipeline until it gets out of the pipeline. And then if it, let's say it there's a massive leak in the Potomac, then it becomes a problem of various agencies to deal with that. But in terms of what's leaking out of these pipelines and their harm for climate forcing, FERC is saying, we pass on that. We're not going to do anything about it. Next slide. Fortunately for us in the state of Maryland, we have Attorney General Frosch has signed on with 6 other attorneys general to challenge the FERC on their failure to deal with methane as a greenhouse gas. And I think that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Annie. So next we're going to hear from Ruth Alice. She's going to report on the No New Fossil Fuels campaign.
Yes, I see Brooke is on the call too.
Yes.
From CCAN. She sponsored a meeting a few weeks ago in Annapolis on the No New Fossil Fuels campaign. This is the agenda. And there's 3 focuses and 3 groups that are continuing to work that began meeting at this event. A Frontline Communities group, grassroots outreach group. I just touched my screen. And frontline communities and grassroots outreach, I think, together, an electoral group and also a legislative group. There is a declaration of no new fossil fuel development in Maryland that's in draft. Pretty close to final, I think, but there's a conference call coming up on Wednesday where I think the last few comments of this will be obtained. This is information that Brooke sent out about an organizing call on Wednesday. They'll discuss, we will discuss the organizational outreach, the declaration, which many groups are signing on to. The Sierra Club will participate in this campaign, and many other groups in Maryland are already signing on. Future plans. And then on the same number, that's at 6 o'clock, at 7, those that want to be involved in electoral outreach will talk. Another subcommittee of the legislative subcommittee has already started meeting and are talking about potential things that we can ask the legislature to do to help us in our fight against fossil fuel infrastructure in Maryland. And I guess that's it. We can leave other things for the Q&A.
Okie dokie. Okay, so next, Jill is going to tell us about the Reinventing Power movie. Oh, Jill, you're muted.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Moving Maryland rapidly to clean, renewable energy is the best way to help to protect our health and environment from dirty fracked gas infrastructure. And for this reason, the Beyond Gas Committee is now spreading the word about clean, renewable energy like solar and offshore wind. And fortunately, the Sierra Club has just produced a wonderful tool to help us easily educate people about the many virtues of clean, renewable energy. And that is the movie Reinventing Power, which you're seeing a screenshot of there. I can't say enough about how great this movie is. It takes the exact approach that we need for Maryland. It tells how clean renewables like solar and wind power are good for the economy and economical too. It shows how this can bring good 21st century jobs to our state. And it even has an example of how offshore wind can boost tourism, which is particularly relevant for Maryland. So we hope that all of you will consider getting a free copy of this film from the National Sierra Club to show in your community, in your neighborhood library, school, church, or even in your home. We can all become multipliers of the great news about our clean energy future very easily with this. And this movie is a perfect tool to tie into other efforts as well. You could host a movie showing and have a brief program about the fracked gas infrastructure threats in your community or elsewhere in the state. And then you can say, there's no reason to put up with this dirty, unhealthy infrastructure when clean, renewable energy is now a viable solution. And we can also use this to promote events like around September 8th, Rise for Climate Action, which you're going to hear more about in a few minutes. So, for example, I'm hosting a showing of the movie at my neighborhood library in Montgomery County on September 4th, the day after Labor Day, and I'm going to use that as an opportunity to invite my neighbors to the Rise for Climate Action events in the county the following weekend. So after this call, we'll send you an email address for requesting the film Reinventing Power, and once your request is received, you should receive your DVD in about 10 days. Also, for those who want to show it later on in the fall, we expect the movie to be available online by September, and we'll let you know once that happens. And finally, I'd like to say something about the clever title of this movie. Reinventing Power is not just about energy generation. It is also about our people's power. The move to clean energy is not going to come from above. It's going to come from each of us using our power to move our society toward the real solution. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jill.
Sure.
Okay, and so the next thing we're going to do now is our director, Josh Tolkien, is going to speak on Sierra Club and the election. Josh, are you on the line and are you unmuted?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Well, hi everybody, this is Josh Tolkien, director of the Maryland chapter. First, let me commend the call organizers because I was scheduled to talk at 7:40 and it is 7:41, and nothing gives me more faith in the power of a movement than a well-run conference call. And I am not kidding, and I hope you are all not laughing. This is just a very encouraging sign. So props to the whole gas team. And Jill, thank you for a great segue there. Elections are watershed moments. They're chances for us to redefine conversations at the national level, at the state level, and redefine how people understand certain issues. And it's clear that it's a critical time for us to help people understand that the fight against climate change has no room for a 30 or 50 year, quote, bridge fuel, that the transition to renewable energy needs to be from fossil fuels to renewable energy in one step with no extended bridge in between. And what we need is every climate champion running for office to be simple and clear and compelling in this message. So what we're encouraging everybody to do is to utilize the opportunity of the election to lift up this issue in a climate context and to help get the whole conversation at the state on message. Here's what this looks like. You know, number one, turn out to candidate events or confer with the candidates who are running in your area and share an invitation to any of the events or the movies that you're putting on. Share the fact sheets and the information and encourage them to learn more about this issue and to get on message. Secondly, if you have the opportunity to ask questions, make sure to ask a question at a forum or an event. You know, try not to be accusatory. The best question is the one where if somebody doesn't know the answer, they're going to be excited to work with us to learn more. And we want more and more people to be talking about the importance of addressing and stopping gas infrastructure as part of our climate strategy. Third, letters to the editor are a great way to inform not just the public, but also the newspapers about this issue. And we've seen over the years that letters to the editor can inform the type of media coverage. So the more letters to the editor that we get printed about this issue, the more I think we'll see the newspapers and the candidates talking about it. Now, if you've noticed, I haven't talked about any specific candidates. That's because I can't on this call get into Sierra Club's electoral strategy, except to let you know that Sierra Club has an electoral strategy, and we will be working on that side to be helping our endorsed candidates understand and talk in a compelling way about this issue. If you're interested in learning more about our political strategy, I need you to contact me or Betsy Johnson, who's our political chair, and we'll send around that contact information afterwards. We will be looking to elevate this issue to the two gubernatorial candidates, to the multiple gubernatorial candidates, which includes Republican, Democrat, and Green Party all running, and look to make sure that this comes up in gubernatorial debates and any other public forums so that we're pushing this front and center. And anytime a candidate, gubernatorial or state, comes to your area, we're encouraging everybody to be as politely insistent as possible in making this part of the conversation. I'm going to pause there and turn it back to the hosts of the call, but I will be staying on for the Q&A portion as well. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk.
All right, thank you, Josh. And so for the final point before Q&A, we're going to hear from our conservation organizer in the chapter, Zach Gertis, on the September 8th Rise for Climate Action. Go ahead, Zach.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Deirdre. So you're probably all familiar with the People's Climate March, which took place in DC last year, or the previous one which took place in New York. So the People's Climate Movement is back again for a day of action in 2018. So on September 8th and some events on September 9th, groups around the country are going to be organizing a series of events under the theme Rise for Climate, Jobs, and Justice. So this is going to be very similar to the People's Climate March, but instead of a drive to get folks all to one major city, there will be a series of events around the country. So there are going to be a few things happening around Maryland. There are going to be film screenings, like some screenings of Reinventing Power, events with speakers, rallies. Two quick events to note are rallies happening both in Baltimore and Rockville. So you can check out some of the list of events that are taking place or are currently scheduled on peoplesclimate.org to find all of the events and find out the ones that are happening near you. Or you can also stay tuned to the Maryland chapter gas list. We'll of course send out all the events that we're working with. The Maryland chapter, the Sierra Club, is working closely with our local Sierra Club groups around the state to work with them to organize a few events and with other partner organizations. So stay tuned and you'll see a lot of those happening. And I will also make the quick pitch. If you're interested in not just attending one of these events, would maybe like to help organize one, feel free to reach out to me or to your local Sierra Club group directly, and you can get plugged in to help with that effort.
All right, thank you, Zach. Thanks everyone for sticking with us. That brings us right about to where we hoped we would be at this point, actually a couple minutes early. So I hope that you all have been keeping track of any questions or thoughts that came up for you while we were going over what's happening across the state. So the way we're going to do the question and answer is, Zach, do you want to explain the hand raise option for those who are logged on a computer?
Sure. Okay, so everyone, for this Q&A period, I've had everyone listed on mute by default, but you can, of course, unmute yourselves. So I'm going to ask that everyone keep yourself on mute if you're not talking, so we can try to do this one at a time best as we can. You can, of course, feel free to type into the chat if you are at your computer, and then Deirdre or someone else will read it out and we'll get that question answered. Or you can unmute yourself and select the option to raise your hand, which I think you would do by clicking on the more option near the chat. Is that right? To hit raise your hand? I can't actually see it since I'm technically on the organizer account. So Deirdre, someone else will have to confirm that for me.
Yeah, I think it's the more.
So then if you hit chat at the bottom on your toolbar and then hit the more option, then you can raise your hand.
Valerie practice.
There you go. Thank you, Valerie.
Thanks. Okay. All right, so we have a couple questions in the chat box already. So I'm going to go ahead and start with those. And then Valerie says you can go to participants and then hit raise hand. So the first question is, Lore asked a couple of questions about a brief explanation of community solar. Annie, you responded in the chat box, but would you want to take a second to respond so everybody can hear what you explained?
Yeah, there are, I think, 4 prototype community solar projects in the state in various stages of development. And there are at least 2 organizations that are involved with these. The one that I had contact with is Maryland Sun Solar United Neighbors. And they're pretty willing to travel the state to bring presentations. So it worked very naturally because we're saturated out here with terrestrial wind, which we don't want any more of. We're supporting ocean wind, but we are ripe for potential solar development on brownfields, especially old strip mining sites. So it's nice. There are very few places in Maryland right now that are being encouraging in their zoning for solar siting, particularly for larger scale solar siting. So I think it's a very positive way to follow in this film. If you cannot get someone from an organization to come, I'd say at least try to get someone who has knowledge of community solar, who can field some questions and point folks in the right direction. And there are a lot of resources online that you can get from Maryland Sun.
Thanks. Okay, so then we have a question from Lily. Actually, it was a comment. Lily said, I'd like to make a brief comment following up on Rosa's comment about Dominion's interest in expanding the Cove Point facility by about 75 acres. Lily, are you able to unmute yourself to make that comment?
I believe I'm unmuted.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks. I just wanted to mention that I just came from Calvert County Environmental Commission meeting where they had a guest speaker from Dominion. It was supposed to be Mike Frederick, but it was some guy whose name I didn't catch, but he's the environmental supervisor. And I was there specifically to ask them about this. And so I asked him, I just said we had heard that Dominion was interested in doing a land swap to potentially be able to add another 75 acres along the northern boundary. And I asked him what that was for. And he said, I don't know anything about the expansion, but he didn't say there are no plans for an expansion, which I thought was interesting. And then he said, I mean, I've heard of it, but it's not something, you know, it's in the very early stages. And at some point, you know, when it gets further along, we will then, of course, contact the stakeholders and, you know, ask them for their thoughts or something like that. And so I played sort of dumb and asked who the stakeholders were. And actually, he doesn't have most of the names right, but he does get Sierra Club right. So I just wanted to raise that because it just, to me, it sounded like, again, the question is not if, but when and how we get there. So it was just to sort of follow up on Rosa's, you know, sort of presentation about that thing. So that's all.
Thank you very much, Lily. And thank you for sharing it on this forum. I think the best thing that we can do at this point is keep these lines of communication open because I wasn't, as you know, I wasn't at that meeting, and thank you for raising the question there. It is always interesting to me to hear the way that they're going about this whole thing. I mean, initially when it was brought up in the trust meeting, it was not on the agenda. It was not a note. It was literally, it sounded to the trustees at the meeting, I wasn't one, but it sounded to the trustees at the meeting like it was a, hey, interested in this thing? Like, hey, we could do this for you. It was not a formal proposition. So I'm glad that you got the answer that you did. Well, no, I'm not glad for the answer, but thank you for asking it. And we will continue following up. If you and anyone on this call wants to work with us in any other Southern Marylanders or interested parties, we need this kind of information. Yeah, thank you.
And I just want to say too that Emily has been a huge help in all this stuff, and sort of so my comments were to add to her description of what was going on, just because I literally just come back from these people. Does that make sense?
I didn't catch who you said made the original comments.
Oh, I said Emily. I'm sorry, Rosa.
Oh,
Rosa Emily Hans. Sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, this was just because I actually walked out of the meeting so that I could come in on the call, which I came in on late, but I just wanted to bring that tiny little bit of insight to it.
yeah. I mean, from what I understand, they've again off the cuff mentioned it the first time. Then they called the chapter office to make a verbal offer. Then they casually brought it up again at the meeting. We've never said that we have any interest in modifying the agreement, but we have asked the questions that it sounds like you asked and other folks were asking at this event, and we haven't gotten any clear answer out of them. But again, as Kelly said earlier on, we know what they're after, and other facilities that are like this one have more liquefaction trains. We are the only facility that has only the one liquefaction train, so it stands to reason that that would be the thing that they would want for any expansion project, because they've already got the export facility, unfortunately. And very recently, probably folks already on the call already know, but they also have been granted the Public Service Commission, the PSC, air quality permit to pump tons more volatile, the VOCs into the atmosphere. So they've kind of cleared the way for future expansion, which is not good.
All right. Well, thank you, Lily, and thank you, Rosa. Zach, do we have any hands up from your end?
No, I don't see any other hands up. Folks can feel free to hit something in the chat, or if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question as well.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, sure. Yep.
What I'm hearing is, and having followed the work for a while, what I'm hearing is, a whole lot of pushing back against the build out of various types of infrastructure, whether it's pipelines or the export facilities. I'm wondering, and the only point at which I heard something about basically the demand side of the equation was talking about there being no demand from industry yet in West Virginia for the Potomac Pipeline, the gas that's prospectively going to run through that pipeline. But what I'm hearing out in sort of the larger political discussion is just a lot about export. So is there any power in making arguments about shutting down gas plants here and about people using less gas? I mean, it seems like we're in a tough spot in terms of making conservation arguments, or in terms of talking about building out wind and solar in Maryland specifically, because there's just this giant market globally, and to the extent that seems like it can't be sated easily. So I wonder if anyone has anything to say about the sort of utility of making arguments about the build out of this infrastructure based on, well, who's going to use it locally.
Would any of our presenters like to take that on or respond to that?
I can start the conversation. I'm far from an expert, but there's such a glut of gas, and it's low cost, that they not only want to export it, but they seem to be trying to make money with it here as fast as they can. So we think they fabricate or exaggerate. They have to, in order to build a pipeline, they have to say there's a local need. But we're very skeptical about the local needs.
Mm-hmm.
We know that in the states around us, in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, they're building plastic plants just to have a use for the gas.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And very, very disturbing. They call them cracker plants, and they're very polluting. So we think, and there is the danger that some of the existing coal plants could be converted to gas.
Mm-hmm.
We just have to keep on, and we do know that in our state, that the Maryland Department of the Environment, we've been going to the mitigation task force meetings of the Maryland Climate Commission, and we've also been meeting, some of us have been meeting through other groups that we're in as Sierra, also as Sierra Club people, that they're still saying at the state level that gas is a bridge fuel. And if we don't push for renewables fast, we're going to have this build out of gas, and it will delay the renewables. It's a great concern. And maybe others have something to say about that.
This is Annie. I have one thing to say, and I was just typing a response to Stephanie, so let me go to Laura. Electricity demand is actually down across the nation. So one of the things that the first of the fact sheets addresses, the Sierra Club one, is the myth of demand. Demand is so low in this country and gas prices are so low. That's why there's pressure to build pipelines to carry natural gas liquids like the ethane that they're using to crack in the Ohio Valley to make plastics, or to export from Cove Point. So they're creating markets, whether it's chemical fertilizers, pesticides. They use these fluids in making perfumes. They're putting it everywhere that they can because they have such a glut on the market right now. So I think it's an opposite problem. And the task for us is to be sure that investment capacity in this country is going to clean renewables rather than building out this infrastructure that, as I said in my presentation, lasts anywhere from 30 to 70 years. So we are conserving already. That's why electricity is down, and also we're being a lot better about holding on to the energy that we bring into our homes.
And if I may say something, is my mic on?
Yep.
Okay. What you brought up a very good point. And gas for there's a great history of the fossil fuel industry in the United States in the book by Winona Howder, the executive director of Food and Water Watch. It's called Frackopoly, and came out a couple of years ago. I recommend that highly. And it shows how the whole fossil fuel industry from the turn of the 20th century has been subsidized by the federal government. And this is supposedly because it's for the common good. It's to meet energy needs of industry and society. Well, U.S. ratepayers and energy users are not benefited by natural gas being exported overseas. So that's something I think that we need to bring up with them. And it's also great that Attorney General Brian Frosch, as Annie mentioned, is one of the states that's party to a lawsuit against FERC. That's not only because they're not accounting for methane, but also these pipeline companies are double dealing. They're partially because of the great profit incentive. They are establishing joint ventures with utility companies and pipeline companies. And then the pipeline companies are saying that there's a need in the local community based on their own company and their own partners. So this is double dealing. So there's a lot of stuff that is not for the benefit of our society, that we're being told that we have to do because the country needs energy. Well, it's becoming more clear every day that it's just for profit. They've got a glut of oil. They can make a quick buck off of building pipelines. And I mean, they've got a glut of gas. They can make a quick buck off of building pipelines. And they want to get them where they can make more money, not where we need it. And we don't need it.
Yeah, excellent, Jill. I just had one other thought, and that goes back to what Josh was saying and what we've been hearing from the Maryland Department of the Environment. Some of our politicians think that gas is a bridge fuel, and we know that it isn't, that it's as dirty in the total life cycle as coal. And then we need to move to renewables. So when we go and talk to candidates, it's very important to ask them to take a stand on moving to renewables as soon as possible, and not viewing gas as a bridge fuel, and to ask those questions. What area of Maryland are you from, JP? And are you connected with a local Sierra Club or active in any of the committees?
I'm in Rockville, and I've just this spring gotten involved with the Montgomery County chapter. So
great, wonderful.
Oh, and I just want to add one more thing about the laws and the federal government always favoring the fossil fuel industry. Eminent domain is an example of how this is really being abused. Eminent domain is supposed to be because it's for a project for the public good. Well, when there's no need, when they're stealing people's land and poisoning their water, that's terrible, and that's something that has to change.
thank you for all those responses.
Yes. Yes, and thank you for the question. Very thoughtful. We have a couple of questions that showed up in the chat box, so I think we'll go over to those. Laura, you said people often forget the power plants in Brandywine. Would anybody like to respond to that?
This is Annie. I wrote Laura. The Food and Water Watch fact sheet does talk about Brandywine, and it's an excellent question. I didn't have time to cover all the types of natural gas infrastructure in the state, but under the previous, and this is the Democratic administration, a call went out to bring more gas service to the state, and we have 2 new power plants, one in construction and one that will be constructed in Brandywine. A lot of these pipelines and other infrastructure, and these are gas electricity generation plants, are being put in rural areas or in areas with populations who don't have as great a voice in government. So Brandywine, I think, is a 72% African-American community, used to be a very rural community, has a pipeline that already goes close to there, so it's natural that they would want to try to tag on a lot of other structures there. And this is what we have to be very wary of. They're going to continue to try to build out natural gas infrastructure, particularly in parts of the states where people are least able to resist, or where there's great economic problems. When we did canvassing in Hancock for the Potomac Pipeline, it seemed like maybe 2/3 of that town was shut down. It was very impoverished. And you could see that there would not be much of opposition mounted in that community, given the economic decimation in that community. So it's hard to mobilize in communities where folks, either a place like Hancock, where there's such a kind of depopulation of the area, most of the businesses have left, or in communities that are already burdened. So Brandywine will have a total of 5 power plants, 1 coal and 4 gas if these all go through.
I'd like to piggyback off of what Annie is saying here, and kind of relate this to the next question that I see on the group chat from James Conklin about how asking, can we attract energy intensive industries that can use solar and wind power to satisfy the requirements of our energy needs, I'm assuming. And I think that's exactly related to this point where we need to take a look at those communities that are being targeted by the gas industry for increased infrastructure projects and work with them specifically to go solar and wind and bring those industries into those areas and not the gas industry. I think that that is going to be helpful in mobilizing that community, because if we don't offer them an alternative, if somebody says jobs, it's hard to say, oh no, I don't want the jobs. We have to not just educate the people there that they shouldn't want this job, but give them an alternative. Otherwise, there's not much that I think we can do in opposition of that.
Thanks, Rosa. I'd also like to speak to James Conklin's question. One great thing about this gubernatorial race is that it opens a great opportunity to talk about, as Josh was saying, what we want to move to, which is clean, renewable energy. And our gas team, our steering committee has been exploring trying to get labor support around promoting jobs. And we'd really love to see, there was a proposal the last legislative session of a bill that included promoting the manufacture of wind turbines in Maryland, and there was a proposal that it be cited in Baltimore to help employment there. And we also heard at the New Fossil Fuels meeting that Ruth Alice has told you about, that people there also want to work on the gubernatorial campaign and talk about the need to move to renewables in terms of job creation. So yeah, we would love to have you work with us, James, or anyone else to brainstorm right now, particularly the month of August coming up. We're going to be having a lot of discussion about what legislation to propose. It takes, a few months to hash it out and find sponsors and everything, but we really think that this is important and a way to refute Governor Hogan's approach and the approach of, unfortunately, some other politicians in Maryland that, oh, it's either the environment or jobs. No, it's the environment and jobs, and that's where the good jobs are. So we'd love to have you work with us on that.
We also got another related response from Valerie, highly interested in working with anyone who wants to help Brandywine switch to renewable energy. I know quite a few fellow Piscataway folks interested. Brandywine has been used as a dumping ground. So Jill, with what you were just saying, it sounds like we do have folks that are interested in doing this work also in Brandywine. So Valerie, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that, if you wanted to speak on the line.
Can you see or hear me?
Both.
Oh, yay, awesome. So I haven't had a whole lot of time to do as much research as I want and enough mobilization around the issue of shifting Brandywine onto something more renewable and a lot less off the dirty infrastructure. But I'm highly interested in working with anyone who can help make that happen. Right now, I'm starting to talk with a few friends who work with I think it's called Grid Solar in DC, and they work primarily with installing solar panels on the roofs of low income and marginalized communities. So I wanted to see if maybe I could help bring that to Brandywine. So that's a thought. Cut maybe some sort of, I don't want to say a deal, but just be more willing to work with the indigenous people in the area, because I know my family is highly interested in switching off of, or switching to using solar panels, for example, and so many other approaches. There's so many other things that we could do here, but if anyone else has any ideas on what to do, please let me know and contact me. I'm all open, I'm all ears for for any ideas on this, because it's completely unfair that the first people to live here, the Piscataway people, are being treated again as and we're bearing the brunt of it, just like everybody else who lives here. But this was our home first. Like, I don't understand how we're watching colonization just continue and no one's saying or doing or hardly doing anything about it, except for obviously organizers like yourselves. Yeah, I could use all the help I can get here.
Hey, Valerie. I am in Southern Maryland. We're close to, and I think I might be one of the closest people to you, other than obviously Kelly on the call. Please reach out to me and let's work together. And I would love to have your energy and enthusiasm and your friends, and we can definitely work together on this. So email me, call me, we'll talk.
This is Josh. Could I pipe in for 1 second?
Yep.
Oh, just want to make sure everyone could hear me. Valerie, this is Josh Tolkien from the Maryland chapter as well. And when you connect with Rosa, she can loop me in. We do have a lot of connections with different organizations that are promoting community solar. And I would love to either join a conversation or help connect you with other people we know that are looking into this space. I think that we do have a lot of sort of connections and resources, and you've got the inspiration and the idea, and we'd be happy to help on our end. So don't want to flood you with too much, but Rosa, please feel free to loop or connect me in, and I can pull David Smedick in, and we can get some good connections on community solar.
All right. Thanks everyone for these really good responses and questions. Really good to have you all. We have, let's see, Zach said we have a couple hands raised. So before we do that, Valerie, I just wanted to see if you had any other thoughts or questions before we go to the next question.
No, I don't think I have. I do. Maybe I'll just ask personally to the people who have been messaging me on the group message here about Brandywine being in SMECO territory and how that might be difficult. If we don't have the time to talk about it here, I can just email or talk with them personally.
Yeah, so it looks like Laura, would you be able to connect with Valerie on the Brandywine being in SMECO territory?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Laura's thought. Again, part of the problem with SMECO is they're exempt from community solar. So a lot of these ideas are great for Brandywine, but also the organizers in Brandywine aren't as open to having outsiders work with them. Like Ruthala mentioned about community of communities, but a lot of those people don't actually live in Brandywine. But can I just go back to the previous point I was trying to make about Brandywine?
Sure.
Yeah, it's just that a lot of the talk about infrastructure is implying like it's pipelines or compressor stations, or that all the fracked gas is going down to Cove Point. It's all for export. So I think oftentimes when we're having this conversation, we're overlooking the fact that we actually have between 3 and 5 power plants right here in our own state, as someone said, making electricity from natural gas, as well as there's all kinds of people in Maryland that use natural gas for cooking and for their water heaters and so forth. So I don't consider a power plant an infrastructure. I consider it a direct use of natural gas. So just sometimes when we use language like infrastructure, it sounds like we're just building something to move the gas along, and we're not actually consuming it here. So that was kind of the point I was trying to make. I'm happy to try and connect up with people that have questions about SMECO. I'm not actually in Brandywine. I'm having trouble connecting with people in Brandywine, so I think it's its own, issue that it's difficult to address. So that was all I was trying to say before. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. And so Valerie, it looks like Ruth Alice sent Rosa Hans's contact info in the chat box, so you can see that. And we got a hand up from Mary Grant. Mary, do you want to, are you unmuted? Can we?
Yes, I am.
All right, go ahead.
I'm also working on a couple of pipelines in North Carolina. And the latest one is by Mountain Valley Pipeline. And it seems to be all of a sudden there's this burst of energy all over the mid-Atlantic to build pipelines coming out of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And this one would be a 70-mile extension from West Virginia across Virginia and down into North Carolina. And I have a personal interest in that because my brother and I own a farm that is on the proposed route for this pipeline. And then there's a second pipeline that cuts across North Carolina on the eastern side of the state called the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I don't know where it originates. I've only seen the part of the map from the North Carolina-Virginia border to the South Carolina border. But and this is an area where, again, there's no need for this additional supply coming out of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. The Southern Environmental Law Center and Appalachian Mountain Advocates asked a company called Synapse Energy Economics to do a report on supply and demand. And I just finished reading it. It's a very carefully crafted report. It's filled with statistics and makes a really good argument on why these pipelines are not needed. That there's plenty of gas for at least the next 30 years in this area. I don't know if anybody's done a similar report for Maryland.
Not to my knowledge. I've also read that report and it's excellent. And we've used that in Maryland, including in addressing issues with the Potomac Pipeline because of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's guaranteed rate of return on investment of 14%, which they're giving most of these pipeline projects. Another way in which, as Jill referred earlier, to how these are being subsidized. So no, I wish there were more that were specific to other areas, but because that is in this region, there are a lot of good nuggets from that report that are helpful for looking at pipelines in this region.
Has the Sierra Club thought about doing a rather rigorous, or having somebody do a rather rigorous study of the need for the pipeline here in Maryland?
The Potomac?
No, John?
Yeah.
There's on the groundwork of, no, I don't believe that that's been studied by Sierra Club, but there was a lot of work at the county level with county commissioners to determine what the need was. After the pipeline was approved, it comes to pass that Jefferson County wants to do a rock wool facility, which is apparently a very polluting kind of, this is an industrial cloth that's used in a variety of ways. So a lot of economic development directors will keep under wraps what they're looking at of who they're trying to attract, and they'll wait and be sure they can get the gas and then tie it into industry they're trying to attract.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Mary. So we have time for one more question. Lily, you had your hand up. I also saw that you were typing in the chat box, but did you have a question that
yeah.
Sure, go ahead. Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh, I unmuted it and I must have gotten my finger on it again. Sorry.
There you go.
So it's very quick. I forgot to mention when I was talking about this presentation that I was at tonight that the Dominion guy said that he would make the presentation available to the Environmental Commission. And I think they are planning to make it available to the public, but in any case, are people interested in seeing Dominion's presentation of where it is and how great it is? They have Okay. So who do I send it to?
You,
Should I send it to Josh or Rosa or somebody?
Sure, you can send it to me.
Okay, that's all. I'll get off
I'll
because,
forward it to everybody.
okay, I don't want to waste somebody else's real last question. Okay.
Do we want to send that out to the whole gas team?
yeah, Rosa, if you could pass that along to a member of the gas team. Thank you.
Of the steering committee, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I don't see any other questions in the chat box. Zach, are there any other hands raised?
I still see Laura still has her hand raised. Do you have a question? Looks like you're waving your hand, so I think we are all set unless there's anyone else.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Gas work is not easy, but it's critically important at this strange turn in the history of humans and our interaction with the environment. So greatly appreciate everyone being on tonight and taking the time to learn and share. Do any of our gas team members want to give a final word?
Yeah, I would just like to say, if you have any feedback for us on how this call went and ways we can improve it for the future, please let us know.
And we will, we recorded this presentation, so all of this can be sent out to everybody. We will follow up and make sure people can see the presentation as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.